Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Eric Eichhoff, and I serve as the Associate Director of Alumni Relations at John Carroll. Thank you for joining us this evening for our next installment of the John Carroll University Alumni Author Series. The Alumni Author Series was launched in November 2020 as a way to highlight those who have written books, articles, poems, screenplay, and other written works within our John Carroll University alumni community. Today, we are joined by Dolores D. Christie, Ph.D., a graduate alumna of the JCU class of 1978. Before I introduce Dee, I'd like to provide you with a few tips for tonight's program. Please make sure you're muted just through the beginning part of the program. If you have questions for Dee, please hold them until the end, and we're going to let you ask Dee yourself, or you could use the chat feature if you prefer that. It is now my honor to introduce Dolores L. Christie, better known as Dee. Dee Christie is a retired college professor and experienced clinical ethicist. The author of Last Rites, A Catholic Perspective on End-of-Life Decisions, 2003, and Moral Choice, A Christian Worldview of Ethics, 2013. She was executive director of the CTSA and currently serves on the Chemical Dependency Committee for the Ohio Solid Organ Transplant Consortium and the Ethics Committee for the Hospice of the Western Reserve. She and her physician husband live in Cleveland. And tonight we're going to be talking a little bit about her new book, It's Time. Yes. Dee, how are you doing this evening? It's great to see you.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
I really appreciate you taking time to be with us this evening.
Well, thank you. Yeah. I appreciate those of you who came in from the rain in Cleveland and wherever else you are to join us. Eric has asked me to do a brief kind of what did I want to say before you folks want to ask questions. When I was preparing this book for the publisher, one of the things they wanted to know was, why did I write this book? And I got to thinking about this, and this is actually my fourth book, if you want to count the dissertation that got published. And mostly they were academic books. I'm getting too old for footnotes, so part of me said, I think I'm going to try something different. But that wasn't the real reason. I actually started out life as a biologist. I have master's work in biology. And then we moved around a lot, came back to Cleveland, and I decided, to stay home and take care of the kids mostly, until I ended up back in graduate school at John Carroll University. I met Dr. George Canody, who at the time was the moral theologian and bioethicist at the university. And I thought, nah, my husband's a physician. I'm not going to do that stuff. Well, I ended up, after teaching part-time at Carroll and teaching part-time at Baldwin Wallace, at Ursuline College in Cleveland, where they needed somebody to teach bioethics, and guess who got elected? So I began to hear the stories from classes that I was teaching. I once walked into a classroom where they were doing various moral issues, and the team that had done this had the classroom broken down into pro-life, pro-choice, and undecided. And when the students came in, they were supposed to choose which category they belonged to and sit there. And I said, well, I can't do that because, in fact, to choose an abortion or to choose not to have an abortion, you have to have choice. And if you don't have choice, you can't make a moral decision. And I think that has been a thing that has guided my own moral stuff, most of what I've written and most of what I think. But when I got to Ursuline and started to teach nursing students, and as I've gotten older myself, and as I've sat on various ethics committees, I find that there are often serious questions. And the questions don't have right answers. And that was one of Dr. Canody's big things, that there's no such thing as a right answer. There's such thing as a good answer. And a good answer requires some thoughtful looking at the facts of the case, seeing what your choices are, and then trying to make the best decision possible, which is hopefully a good decision. The trouble with bioethics is that it is hard often to get beyond your own feelings. Think about a mother and a father with a baby that's dying. You know, what do you do? The emotion clouds you in the moment. You don't want the baby to die, but you don't want the baby to suffer. You don't want the baby you want everything to go away. It's like with COVID, I think we have seen this with so many hard decisions and so many hard decisions that have never had the opportunity to be thought through. So the books I've written have basically dealt with that. And I have one called Last Rites, which is sort of academic and detached. But more and more I see that each person's human experience constructs the narratives from which we draw our yeses and nos. We happened to have dinner with friends the other night, and the husband in the family is dealing with a relative who is demented and is a hoarder and is not taking care of herself. Do you pull her out of her house? And the man says to her, well, so-and-so, wouldn't you, we could find a place for you to live where you wouldn't have all the expense of a huge house, probably about as big as ours, which has 6 bedrooms. And the woman goes to him, no. And I found myself reacting viscerally because I feel the same way. But this woman doesn't have the opportunity to speak with any kind of authority any longer. Why didn't somebody think earlier on to ask her those questions? Why didn't somebody think why didn't she think as she began to get demented to put her wishes into writing and think through some of the possibilities? Every time I go to an ethics committee meeting at the Hospice of the Western Reserve, or even on the Solid Organ Transplant Committee, I find myself adding things to my advanced directives. So why did I write this book? Mainly, I wrote this book to put some of the stories of serious moral issues in a book form. Now, if you don't care about the moral issues per se, you can read the book because the stories are pretty good just in themselves. It's kind of like some of the episodes of Law and Order or Special Victims where you don't have a good ending, the thing kind of ends and you want to say, oh, please make it happen for me, make it end. This book has a lot of stories that end ambiguously. So if you go to read it, I'm sorry, that's how it is. But there is also contained in this book at the end some specific questions for each of the stories that sort of get at the moral issues, and what are the questions that I might ask if this particular issue came either to my committee or to my relative or to myself. And then there's a matrix in general for how to make moral decisions. Now, you might ask, are these stories real? Well, some of them, and some of you who know me will pick out characters in the book that the names have been changed, the towns have been changed to protect the innocent. But there's some stories that are very historically and literally true. But there are a lot of stories that have been composited from the ethics committees that I've been on, which of course, you don't talk about. But the issues are not limited to the one story. And there's at least one story where the major character is a composite of 2 people with the same moral issue. And the backstory goes all the way to my high school and picks up a couple of people with whom I went to high school. So is it fiction? To some degree, yes. Apparently they're calling it these days creative nonfiction. Is it true even if it's fiction? Absolutely. Any of you who've ever had to deal with serious moral questions related to medical issues, and I know at least some of you in this group that I look around to have had to deal with those. you'll find resonance, I think, in some of these stories. So I wrote it for anybody who cares to read short stories. It's a quick read, the whole book. But I also wrote it for professionals and people preparing for professional life in a way that they could look at some of these issues before they were faced with them in a critical situation. It's so much easier if you thought them through. I remember having a conversation with our children one day, and one of our children said to me, well, Mom, you know, what if you were in a locked in state? Would you want us to stop feeding you if you didn't eat on your own? Would you want to, whatever? And I said that for me would be terrible, to be able to look out, knowing the suffering you folks were, my children, were going through, and not be able to respond in any way. So, you know, maybe these stories will prompt conversation. Maybe they will resonate with people who've already gone through this. One of the reviewers who wrote a review that's online, if you ever want to read it, said he went to review this book at the beginning of the pandemic and didn't really want to review it at all because the pandemic was bad enough without having to read stories about aging, illness, and death. But it's out there. It will bring some of the emotional aspects of this kind of moral decision making. And I hope it will help professionals and individuals facing these stories to make their decisions more reasonably and more thoughtfully, and probably will end up much better with good decisions, not necessarily what is one right decision. Because different people will make different decisions depending on their experience, depending on how they prioritize their values. Okay, I'll shut up.
Well, Dee, thank you so much for kind of walking us through what It's Time is about, and why you wrote it, and it sounds like a really important book, because as I was talking with a colleague of mine today, most people will face these kinds of discussions or decisions unless you just kind of die a quick death in an accident or something like that. You need to have these kind of discussions with people that you love, and whether it be by your own time or your loved one's time. So I think it's great that you wrote this in an approachable way for either the academic or the person who just is interested in learning more about that type of stuff. So so kudos to you for doing that. One question, I have a number of questions, but to those joining us, if you do have questions, again, please use the chat, or we're gonna have wait to the end. You can use and we'll turn off the mute, and you can ask that way. But Dee, clearly you've been doing this for a long time, and you've probably seen things that we can only imagine of, and heard of different stories. Were there things that surprised you, or that you learned that you may not have thought about when you were writing this book, It's Time?
What always surprises me when I write is that usually stories write themselves. And somewhat with this book, but I've also written a memoir, which I may or may not ever share with my children. But I found as I was writing the book, it was writing itself, and I began to see that so much of the book said more about my mother than it did about me as an autobiography. And I had always had the vision that I really knew more about my father than my mother. And both of them, by the way, are in this book in different stories. But I think it surprised me. And now when I read almost anything, I get a little amused, because I have the feeling that we're seeing more of the author than the author thought they were going to be saying about themselves. And that's sort of a clue, even when you're maybe especially when you're reading a novel. If you're going to write authentically, the only way you can do that is by pouring who you are out. Now, it comes out in pieces and parts,
Mhm.
and it comes out in different ways. And you knit it together, you know, you put a little lace on it, a little decoration, but basically you're writing yourself. And, you know, I don't know how many in the group believe in heaven, but for those who don't, it's a way to leave a piece of yourself behind.
That makes sense. That makes complete sense. And, you know, I think we've done probably 6 or 7 of our author series, and I always love asking about the writer's process, and because everyone has a different process of writing, right?
It all includes slitting your wrists on occasion.
And some it comes very easily, some it's more of a challenge. Sometimes one book is easier than the next book you'd write. I know you've written, you've already mentioned the other books you've written. How does its time compare to those other books that you have written?
In terms of its ease or what?
Ease, yeah, ease and maybe subject matter. I know you said one's very academic.
Well, the first one was the dissertation, and if you want to go through hell, write a dissertation. I fortunately had a mentor who himself had a master's in English. So he was very responsive to anything I wrote and wouldn't let me get away with anything. I finished the last chapter and thought, I'm done, good. And he said, pardon the expression, this is a shitty piece of work, do it again. It won't be publishable otherwise. And it ended up getting published in a series smack after a very important theologian. So I felt pretty good about that. And it was largely due to his pushing me. But this book, in some ways, was much easier to write. As I said, no footnotes. You know, you didn't have to be very precise and make sure you didn't miss somebody. But it was for me technically harder because this particular publisher wanted the author to do all the formatting. So I learned more than I ever wanted to know about word and footnotes and page breaks and all of that fun stuff. My master's thesis was written on erasable paper on a typewriter. That's where we were at John Carroll. If anybody wants to read that, that one's pretty good. It's on The Beloved Disciple, and it's on a shelf somewhere in the religious studies department. You know, there you had to erase a lot and pull out the papers and scream and cry a lot. But this book flowed. 2 of the stories had already been published, one in Commonweal and one, where the heck was the other one published? I'm blanking. Oh, that's ridiculous. It will come to me in the night. That's one of the things about getting old. The CNN screen moves very, very slowly. I got permission to use it. I'll have to look it up. Anyway, they were, oh, I know, Emmanuel Magazine. And actually that story was on Father Mike Lavelle, who was a good friend of ours who had been president of John Carroll. And he died in a very, you know, very, very young, really, in the gym at John Carroll University, even though they took him to the hospital and kept him alive for almost a month. And the story is really about that ordeal. I think I've lost my train of thought and midrashed out, so I'll stop.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit about ethical decisions, because as I mentioned earlier, you know, everyone is going to have at least a conversation about, you know, death, dying, and illness with someone in their life.
No, they don't have to, but they should.
They should. Good point. They should. What guidance or advice do you have for those who are grappling with difficult decisions around, you know, death, dying, illness, end of life?
I'd say read my books, but no, no. But I think you have to listen. You have to look at what are the elements. George Canody, he used to have a very nice matrix for decision making. A moral dilemma is something where you have more than one choice and the choice isn't obvious immediately. So what do you do with that? You try to explore what are the facts of the case. Now, when I sit on the committee for the transplant consortium, sometimes we get facts. You know, this person is this sick. I now sit on the chemical dependency exception committee. So, you know, how long have they been on a program? Should they get an exception? What's different about this time than when they stopped for the 3 DUIs they had 10 years ago or 12 years ago? So you have to get the morally relevant facts. What are the facts of this particular situation that are relevant to the decision you're trying to make? The fact that the guy owns his own business or likes to wear bright red shirts is not relevant to whether or not he should be on the transplant list for because he hasn't been on long enough to have worked an AA program or whatever. So you find out what are the morally relevant facts to this particular issue. You know, should we pull the plug? Okay, what are the morally relevant facts? The morally relevant facts would be, what are the likelihood of this person surviving if we take them off a ventilator? These are situations that people have had for the last year and a half, very precipitous decisions, sometimes with very young people who probably didn't have this conversation with anybody. When I was teaching students at John Carroll, I said, you know, do you have advanced directives? Well, no, none of them had advanced directives. Well, maybe they should have thought of this, even for themselves, because you never know when you're going to have his bus walking across the street. And you want people to know what you want. So morally relevant facts, what are the values contained in the choices? You know, go back to the abortion issue. Life is a value. Okay, are you talking one life? Are you talking the life of the child? Are you talking the life of the mother and the child? What are the odds of the mother's going, the doctor says to the mother, if you don't have an abortion, you're going to die. Well, what are the odds of my going to die? I need to know that if I'm going to make a decision. If the child is horribly deformed, does that make a difference in my value system? Again, I don't want to make a judgment here, but those are the kinds you look at. And each of us is going to have our own system of values. Some of them come from our religious traditions. Some of them come from our parents. I used to use in class always you know, somebody told you when you were a little kid and were going out in the rain, be sure you wear your rubbers. And of course, any 18-year-old has a much different version of what that means. You know, you got a lot of titters in the back of the room, but you have stuff that comes from your parents, from your religious tradition, from your culture. You know, we're wrestling with that, with issues that we never thought about 40 years ago. They were there, but we didn't think about them, like transgender people, like gay people, like Black people. You know, we didn't really until the pandemic see what poverty looks like, what people in food lines look like until this issue. So what are the morally relevant facts? What are our values that we've gotten? There's a whole field of theology called liberation theology, that one of the things they do is you find the liberation people are uncomfortable. Something's wrong. We don't know what's wrong. Oh, let's look at the narratives and the values that are making this maybe wrong. And how do we critique those and what do we do with it? And when you have a moral dilemma, there's usually a place where you're stuck. What is causing you not to be able to make a decision? Is it because you don't know the facts? Is it because you've got competing values? Well, you have to pick that out and say, which value is more important to me? Being safe or being free in my own home? You know, should I go to a nursing home because I might fall? Well, maybe I'd rather fall and stay in my own home. Those values are attention. So I have to look at that. Then I make a choice. And one of the things George Canodi always said was, after you make a decision, you look back and critique what you've learned from that. And that's why this book is great, because if you're a student in a class reading this book and looking at these issues, you might think through them more deeply than you will have the time to do when the decision is right in front of your face. So,
Well, thank you for sharing all that, Dee. I think those are.
You just got my short course in moral theology.
Well, I appreciate it, and I think everyone else does too. I think that kind of advice and thinking through things is always important. And it's just like they say, you practice, so when you need to have the actual conversation, you have that opportunity, and it's not the first time you've done it. So quick question from Mary Jane.
Yeah, I just pulled it up.
Yeah, in your book, do you address the ordeal of those who have had to make the difficult decision of who lives or dies during the duress Katrina at the hospitals?
Yeah, that was actually a big issue that came up at the CTSA convention in New Orleans the year after that. And there were a bunch of people dying on an upper floor of the hospital right in downtown downtown New Orleans. And basically they could not get them all to the helicopter because some of them could not be moved on this tiny little staircase that went to the roof. So that was a very serious decision. And because they were already dying, they were actively dying, what they did was give these folks morphine so that their death would be less arduous, and they evacuated the people you can. These are the kinds of decisions where there ain't no one right answer. I think in Katrina, you always have those, well, not only in Katrina, but you have those decisions, and you do the best you can. You weigh the pros and cons of the different choices, and you go with what works. I cannot make a decision. I can look at it theoretically and I can give you the bones of how to make it, but I can't tell you what decision you will make. And in the Christian tradition, that's a very important thing. One of my favorite passages is the Markan version of the rich young man. What do I need to do to be perfect? Lord, I've done everything I can. What should I do? And Jesus says to the guy, well, sell what you have, give it to the poor, and come and follow me. And the rich young man isn't quite there yet. And a good spiritual director knows when people aren't quite there yet. And Jesus watches the guy walk away. Now you'd expect he knows what the right thing is. Does he grab him by the neck and say, you got to do it my way? No, he lets the person come to that conclusion on his own, and maybe he won't. And I think we have to respect the decisions other people make. We have to help them ask the right questions, but you can't find a right answer. And when you're in a situation like Katrina, it's almost worse because a decision has to be made, and it has to be made now. And no matter what you do, the decision's gonna have some bad stuff with it. Mm-hmm. There's a line in Louis Janssen's, who I did my dissertation on, and he says, always serious moral decisions have some consequences that are bad. As human beings, the only thing we must do is when we have to make those kinds of decisions that we regret it, that we regret the bad consequences. If you're a surgeon and you have somebody who's got a cancer and you have to cut off a limb, if you're a surgeon who says, oh, gee, fun, I get to cut off the limb today, there's something wrong. I should regret having to do that. I should have empathy for the fact that you will have to live for the rest of your life without your leg.
Yeah.
If I lose that empathy, that compassion, that hurting with the other person, I have ceased to be a human being. So I don't know if that answers your question, Mary Jane.
It looks like it does. um, so I have a couple more questions, and then again, I wanted to open this up to everyone else who's joined us for other questions if you have them. One thing, as I mentioned, I've had the privilege of speaking with a lot of alums who are authors and written a variety of books from, leadership, self-help, teaching, financial planning, kids books, novels, memoirs, a little bit of everything. And one of the questions I love asking is, what advice would you give a fellow alum if they had an interest in writing a book? Because again, everyone's experience in writing is different. I think every author can glean a little bit from someone who's written a book and kind of gone through some challenges. So what advice would you give someone who's interested in
Okay,
writing a book?
I would say a couple of things.
Okay.
The first advice I will give you, the advice I was given when I was writing my dissertation. If you hit the wall, go do something fun. If the tank is empty, don't keep trying to pour something out of it. It's like, squeezing a plastic toothpaste tube and there's nothing left.
Yep.
So, take a break, go, cut down a tree or water the lawn or take a walk or go see a movie. So that's the first piece. But I think you probably want to have a good idea. If you have contacts, use them. If you're at the convention of the CTSA, you wander around and chat with the booksellers. If you don't have contacts, try to find some. Try to find some people with whom to talk. I would also suggest having somebody else with a different eye read what you write, because generally when one writes, not only do you miss periods and say there when you mean there, and the spell check doesn't catch it, but you also sometimes think you're saying what is clear and it may not be. I have sitting at this group a marvelous editor who critiques very seriously everything I write. And, this makes no sense, Dee, and you need somebody like that to do it. The other thing is, if you're writing a book with technical things in it, get somebody to not proofread, but read over that technical thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then worst case scenario, there's so many people trying to get books published, but you can always self-publish. And that's another option. I have a friend who's written a number of books, and her latest is a rather oddball novel about nuns who escaped from the convent to go and convert Ireland back to Irish Catholicism. And it's an odd book and probably has a narrow audience, but she ended up self-publishing that, even though she published the rest of her stuff otherwise. But think about, I remember a group at John Carroll when we would be looking for, we would critique each other's articles that were in progress. And the first question someone in the group always asked was, who's your audience? So if you're an author, who's your audience? Is there an audience? And how big is the audience? Maybe, 5, 10, 15, 17 people, most of whom you're related to in one way or another. How big is your audience? What's your audience look like?
And finally, before one last very quick question, I know that you and your husband Dick are incredibly loyal alums. I love when seeing you at a lot of our programs. As a graduate of the university, what was you've talked glowingly about your mentor at John Carroll.
Yeah.
What was your overall experience, and then why have you and Dick stayed involved with John Carroll for so many years?
I thought about that because you asked that ahead. The involvement, I think, began with that initial, I just want to take a course. Why are you making me get involved in getting a master's degree? But at that time, the Blessed Sacrament priests had their seminary students there, and there were two excellent teachers in the department, Joe Neron and Gina Verdier. Frank Costa I didn't take from, no particular reason, so I can't speak to him. But I thought the department was good. It was close at hand. We ended up getting to know several of the Jesuits very, very well. And I think that at the time cemented the bonds to John Carroll. I went back to teach there as an adjunct for many years, brought CTSA back. Father Glynn at the time, who was a member of CTSA, welcomed our bringing the organization to John Carroll's campus. That was certainly something that made me very loyal to the university. But, you know, you stand on the shoulders of your education. Anybody does that. And Dick, who's a really recent graduate of John Carroll, because he went to med school after 3 years and they finally gave him an honorary degree, what, about 10 years ago? And he got to give the valedictory speech at this pseudo graduation. So it's those kinds of bonds, but it also is a university that has opened its doors to people from other countries. There are a number of students at John Carroll, even now, that have come from places like Iraq. And we happened to meet one of the young women from, I think this one was from Iraq. And we said, well, you know, what do you want to be when you grow up? And she said, oh, a plastic surgeon. I thought, oh, come on, honey. You know, what kind of refugee are you? And she went on to say, well, I want to be a plastic surgeon because an uncle of mine was very seriously injured in the Iraqi war. And there were not the places in Iraq for him to go for a care and for a cure. So they had to life flight him out of the country, and he ended up being paralyzed for life.
Oh, wow.
And she wanted to go back to Iraq in order to continue to help people who'd been maimed in war to have their bodies come back to some degree of normal. And I thought, wow, if John Carroll is providing that, this is a good thing. Now, I will say that, you know, sometimes we go to the old folks, I will not use another word, luncheon, and I am aware that there are many alums of John Carroll that don't have a clue. It ain't your grandfather's Oldsmobile or your grandfather's John Carroll University, particularly in religious studies. When I was an undergraduate, I took a couple of summer courses at John Carroll, and I was very much aware that particularly their philosophy and religious department were still in the dark ages. And you know, giving apologetics was kind of the word of the day. And I think there's some people who are alums who want their kids to go to Carroll because they're expecting indoctrination. The good news is they won't get it. They will get good academic stuff. So I guess that sort of answers the question.
No, I appreciate that. And like I said, it's I think one of the things that I am most looking forward to as we kind of return to whatever normal life will look like is seeing people again at our Gold Streaks lunches at different programming. So I'm looking forward to seeing you in the future.
I just want them to take my books in the library. I literally have a car full of books.
Well, we're updating our library. It's an exciting time, and we're
yes. I know Adam was not there to ask today. He was,
yeah, we're doing some good reno in the library. So last question, and I again want to throw this open to everyone else if you have your own questions. And this one hopefully should be easy. If people are interested in buying any of your books, where would you recommend they go to purchase your book?
I'm sure any bookstore would get them for you. Loganberry was going to do a book signing and the pandemic came in. I don't know if they bothered buy any books ahead of time. but you can get it on Amazon, and I think you can probably get a Kindle edition too. I don't remember, but or you can go to directly to the publisher. I would check. That might be cheaper. I don't know.
Okay.
But you can get it on it. And it's a fairly cheap book. It's, as I say, it's a short book. It's paperback. You can take it on vacation with you when you go to visit grandma and are trying to decide whether to put her in a nursing home. You could read it on the plane.
Well, thank you again, Dee. I would entertain any questions you have. So if you do have a question for Dee, go ahead and you should be able to unmute yourself. And then just go ahead and ask away, and we'll take some questions for a few moments, and then we'll wrap it up. So does anyone have any questions?
Yes. Yeah. Ann Kalinowski's right.
Yeah.
That's why I said bookstores first. But I know you can get on Amazon. I do not know if bookstores have gotten it. My understanding is that John Carroll was going to order a copy, so you might, flash your alumni badge and borrow it from John Carroll.
Great.
Do you have a favorite book?
Do I have a favorite book?
Or a very favorite story in the book, I mean?
No.
No?
There is an interesting one, which is a composite about a professor being forcefully retired from a university. That might be fun to read. I think that may be the first. It's hard to say having a favorite, because the ones that have composites from my high school years, I kind of like those. The one on my mother and my father, I kind of like those. There is one that is me, but it's anonymous. You can figure it out when you read the book, maybe. But no, I don't think I have a favorite story. The one that probably touches me most deeply is the one on Mike Lavelle. That wrote itself in a very short time, because it was very cathartic to write that story. When you have somebody whom you know as well as we know Mike, from retreats, from him giving first communion to our youngest daughter, to going on picnics with him, to all sorts of things. That was a very hard loss, particularly for such a young person.
Eric, Fred Kramer.
Yes.
Hey, Fred.
Mary Jane.
You knew you couldn't shut me up, Dave.
No, well, go ahead. I'll answer you, because Mary Jane already wrote, and I'll answer you first, Fred. And what's your question?
Me?
Yeah.
Okay. Number one, a comment. Dick was so committed to John Carroll. I remember when he told me he was leaving after 3 years to go to St. Louis for medical school. He was fully committed and enchanted at that point. And it was just one Jesuit to another school, as far as I was concerned.
Yeah.
On substance, a lot of what you talked about sounded like something back when we were young called situational ethics. Does that term exist anymore?
No,
Whatever happened to it?
that's a very, I'm glad you asked that question, Fred, because situational ethics dissolve, if you take the technical term, it sort of dissolves almost everything I said into how do I feel right now? And that's terrible. That's one of the reasons for reading the book. So you don't just go with the first, can I do eeny, meeny, miny, mo? Okay, I'll do the first answer. I remember once when one of our kids was deciding where to go to college, an older sibling, and the person was sitting in the bedroom with all the brochures around, and an older sibling came in and said, well, why don't you go where I'm going? And this child did, and ended up hating it after a year. So, there isn't always the first choice, but there is something which tends to get tarred with the notion of situational ethics, but it isn't. Moral dilemmas are all situational. You have to look at the situation, but the decision has to be based on here is the bowl full of the situation. Here are the goods, here are the bads. Which solution gives us the better result? So it is situational in that sense. But if you talk about situational ethics in the sense that is convenient, well, my roommate wants to have sex with her boyfriend, so who am I to tell her not to? Well, there's some values involved here, not the least of which is she gets kicked out of her room. But besides that, every moral dilemma happens in a situation, but to make a good decision, you have to tease out the facts, the values, and weigh the good and the bad. It's a dilemma precisely because no matter what you do, it's going to be bad. But you better do it with more good than bad. Example, we want to build a dam. And when we build the dam, we're going to, give water to everybody up here. But to build the dam, we're going to have to displace a bunch of people who have lived in that area. Okay, you weigh that. What's the common good? What's the best situation? What's the best good you can get for this? That's called proportionalism. And there's some who have a lot of problem with that term too, but it isn't situational ethics. It's weighing the good and bad based on values and on prioritization of values. So thank you for the question. Okay, let's get Mary Jane's question up again. She says, here we are. Oh, we've got a couple. Okay, we got the Ann Klanowski. Was there a story you left out? Yes, there are lots of stories. There are more stories. The stories keep coming. I had one story that I wanted to put in, and it was a very serious pediatric story of a little girl, and I changed a lot of the issues in it, who had a very serious eye condition where she had to have her eye removed. And the parents had to make that decision. And I would have loved to put it in, but I wanted to make absolutely sure that the medical things I talked about in the story were accurate. And although I sent it to a couple of people who knew about these things, none of them ever answered me. So it was left out. But if there's another book someday, sweetheart, maybe there will be. I would love to write a story about the long dying process of a very good friend of mine and some of the decisions that were made that were maybe bad decisions. You write what you can at the time. A couple I had to get permission, or I felt I had to get permission from the families, because even though I changed names and changed venues, I knew that the family would recognize. So those are included, but there were at least 3 families from whom I got permission, and one that would have been incredibly awkward. And so I changed as much of the story as I could. And I didn't have to get permission from my parents because they're both dead.
Does anyone else have any other questions for Dee?
Well, it's been good to see you all. It's nice that you were able to come. I hope that this has been of some value. I know personally some of you have already faced some rather serious questions in your own families and friends, and some of you might make my next book. You never know.
Well, Dee, again, thank you so much for taking time this evening to speak with us about this incredibly important topic and share your experiences both about writing it and the stories that are within its time. We are incredibly fortunate to have you within our John Carroll alumni community. So thank you again. And I personally look forward to seeing you in person at a program.
Well, I'm waiting for the old folks luncheons again.
They will come back, I promise. I promise. Before we conclude, I'd like to share with you all a few other opportunities
Oh,
that you can take advantage of this spring and summer, I guess the summer now, through the Office of Alumni Relations and John Carroll University. With the restrictions easing, the Office of Alumni Relations is working to create a variety of programs for our alumni community. We know that we'll continue to offer virtual programming like tonight, but we'll soon be offering in-person opportunities as well. And our first one is going to be on July 15th. And the Cleveland Alumni Chapter is going to be hosting an Alumni and Friends Social at Terrestrial Brewing Company on the near west side of Cleveland. For those who prefer virtual programming, we have a variety of choices as well. This summer, we'll have authors who will share their works on lost Civil War battlefields and the lost Civil War. That's actually this coming Thursday, featuring Lauren DeMarco, who is a alumna and a plain dealer writer. The difficult decision, and then we're also going to talk about the Cleveland Cultural Gardens with one of our alums is, I believe, the executive director of the Cleveland Cultural Gardens, and he's written a novel about those gardens, and it should be a pretty interesting conversation too. We will also be having a alumni continuing education series, better known as ACES, focusing on saying Ignatius, and that program will be featuring Paul V. Murphy in the university's History and Religious Studies Department, as this year marks the 500th anniversary of St. Ignatius's conversion and the Battle of Pamplona, excuse me. And finally, we're focusing on the Ohio and Erie Canal and the Cuyahoga Valley National Park in a program later this year as well. We'll also be offering our JCU junior programs for children of JCU alumni and friends of the university. Topics this year include mythology, hands-on science, space exploration, and vaccines. You can find more information and register for all of our upcoming programs and events at jcu.edu/alumni. Additionally, we invite you to review the recordings of our previous programs on the JCU Alumni Association YouTube channel. To view our extensive library, search John Carroll University on YouTube. And finally, please consider a charitable gift to John Carroll in support of our students, faculty, and our entire campus community. If you have already given this year, thank you for your generosity. It is truly appreciated. If you have not, please join me in supporting JCU so that we can continue to deliver an outstanding education for our current and future Blue Streaks. You can make a donation by visiting jcu.edu/give. Again, thank you for joining us tonight. Take care, be well, stay safe, and onward on, John Carroll.